Okay guys, I'm going to give you my finger, and then we're going to all get shocked by the electrical fence. Okay, you ready? Mari, touch my finger.
What if he shocks your phone?
Okay, ready? We'll see if I can get everybody in it. Okay, ready? Hold still. Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
We're going to be doing chapter 46, which is Phenomonolgy. And I want to just add that this is also known as transcendental philosophy. I have a really long, extensive background in existentialism and its precursor, which is phenomenology, so I have a good understanding of it. So I'm hoping that I can help everybody to better understand what he's saying, not to make a judgment about whether you believe it or not, but just for the sake of understanding the chapter and where he's coming from. So we're going to start here. Just start off reading off in 508, just the beginning of the chapter for those of you guys who are using a Kindle book. It says here that phenomenology's primary engagement with history comes in the form of the following types of questions. 1. Is cognition and more generally experience always historically conditioned and shaped? 2. Are human beings fundamentally historical beings, and what does it mean to insist on this historicity? And 3. Does historiographic knowledge depend on our pre-theoretical historicity? And one of the things I want to drive home is that phenomenology and existentialism have much more to do with philosophy of mind and the philosophy of like psychology than it does philosophy of history or any other metaphysics or anything like that. They're not even trying to pretend like they can understand metaphysics. All the phenomenologist or the existentialist is concerned with is how do human beings perceive reality. This is not deconstructionism. This is not relativism. They do believe truth exists, but what they're concerned about is how do we perceive truth, and how do human beings understand the world at large, and that's his main point. We're going to be starting in Husserl's Phenomenology, the heading here. It says, phenomenology is a radically new way of practicing philosophy with the aim of showing how the world is constituted by conscious subjects. Husserl sought to show why our knowledge can be considered truly objective and not merely a function of the way human beings happen to think. So he's trying to understand the world objectively. That's what he's trying to do. It says here, on the contrary, phenomenology explicitly brackets or sets aside the assumption that there is an external world governed by the laws of science. What he's saying is that the phenomenologist is not worried about science. A phenomenologist would consider science to be the way that the world is measured, not how the world is made up. The world as it is how it is. Science just helps us to understand how it's made up or the measurement of it. So, for example, when it comes to everything we see, we know they're made up of atoms, molecules, then it gets lower, atoms. We don't perceive atoms. Science tells us that things are made up of atoms, but we don't perceive atoms, so the phenomenologist says, who cares? We're not concerned about how the world is made up at the micro level. We're just concerned about how do we perceive the world as it is, and you don't need to perceive atoms to have a functioning understanding of the world. And that's the point of the phenomenologist at this point. And it's not that it's not important. The phenomenologist is just initially interested in how human beings perceive phenomenon, not necessarily the causes of that perception. So he gets into here and he says, the crucial step is called a phenomenological reduction. The method consists in analyzing only what presents itself to consciousness and to focus on it precisely in a way it is given to us. Thus, phenomenology strives to have no presuppositions about anything outside of consciousness. So they're starting with truth, and they're trying to understand the world as it is, and trying to remove the presuppositions. They're trying to start with the way the world really is. When it comes to the history, we'll get to this. Previous philosophers have often taken the I in which consciousness occurs to be the entity in the world. Husserl though regards the I not as part of the world, but as that which makes possible or constitutes or builds up the world. Now stop a second. This is not empiricism. This is not the view that we create the world. Far from it. This is just saying we perceive the world, and we're trying to understand what builds or constitutes our perception of it. Reality is true, but what makes us see it the way we do? That's what they're concerned about. Husserl, according to Husserl, consciousness is always directed at objects. We do not have direct consciousness of and experience of such objects, but not all that we do have. We do have direct consciousness and experience of such objects, but not all their aspects are presented to us directly. For example, when we perceive a table, we do not see the rear side of it, yet we experience it as having one. So when you come into a room, you perceive that the back of the door the back of the door and the doorknob, that there is a doorknob on the other side. You perceive it as having that, even though you don't perceive it as that. And this is going to get into where we talk about history. He says terms of our past experience are retentions, and the terms of the way that we anticipate them in the future, the protensions. For example, we hear a musical tone as being in or out of tune depending on the tones that have preceded it. So consciousness is intersubjective insofar as we experience the world as experienced by others whose consciousness resembles our own. So what he's saying is, and he'll get to this later in the paper, is that we understand that our perception of reality is really made up of past experience. So, for example, or history. So, for example, with the table example, we've perceived tables. We've all been around tables, chairs, desks, couches, and because of that past experience, the history that we've experienced, we understand immediately that when we walk into a room, even though I don't see the back of the table, that the table is just not an illusion and that it's just suspended by two legs. I just assume that it has four legs and that it's being held up like a normal table. Even though I don't perceive it with my eyes, I understand it with my mind. So the phenomenologist understands that we perceive things in their totality. We perceive things as they really are. But they also admit the fact that a lot of that perception has to do with us perceiving things that are analogous or similar in the past. So this is where we get our stereotypes. You have an experience with a bulldog, and then after so many times of having a bad experience with a bulldog, you tend to think, well, bulldogs would probably have a mean disposition or something. It doesn't mean that our perceptions are always true, but we do use past experience to try to wrap our minds around our current present experience, and that's what he's going to get at. So now I'm on phenomenology and history. The first paragraph here, about halfway through, he says, Husserl's bracketing of empirical matters and causal explanations would suggest that history cannot enter into phenomenological inquiry. I don't know where the author is going with that, but Husserl was very strong on the fact that we do have retention, memory of past objects. So just an example here. He says that this is another book of Husserl's, and he's talking about the past and objects, and he says that, yeah, as a fact, he says, of the interval that has expired, we say that we are conscious of it in retentions of an object. Specifically, that we are conscious of those parts or phases of the duration, not sharply to be differentiated, which lie closest to the actual now point, the present, with diminishing clarity, while those parts lying further back in the past are wholly unclear. So he's saying that obviously as memory fades, we have a less and less knowledge of an object. But he does acknowledge the idea that you do have a phenomenological link to recent past objects or events. He says here, we should prefer to avoid talk of appearance when referring to phenomena which constitute temporal objects. So he says we shouldn't talk about objects as appearances. He says, for these phenomena are themselves immanent objects, and our appearance is in wholly different sense. So he argues that we are perceiving reality as reality is. So he's saying we shouldn't look at it as appearances, as if we're perceiving it and we can't connect to it in a very real way, like a Kant would say we don't have a direct knowledge of something. He's saying no. The phenomenon, we do have a direct contact with the phenomena as an object. So anyway, so he continues here, the author, the first author. I'm on 509. If consciousness is shaped by its contingent location in history, so is the way in which things are presented to consciousness. History is always already phenomenologically present and effective in our experience. So he's talking about the importance of history. For Husserl, genetic phenomenology. Genetic phenomenology is committed to the presence of the past in any given present experience. So again, think of the table. He's saying that we require past experience to perceive reality as it really is. If we don't understand what a table is, you're going to look at the table and go, look at it and like walk around it and go, what is up with this thing? Why? Think of a culture where they sit around a table with cushions. If you show them a chair, they may step back and go, why do you have this around this table? And their tables were much lower too. So a table that is at its American height would seem weird to them. Like, why do you have this tall shelf? It's until you have an experience with it that they still perceive it, but they don't understand its purpose until you have a history or experience of it. He goes on to explain what Husserl calls a life world. Life world is not the world as the totality of all that exists, or the physical world as studied by science, not the makeup of atoms and all this kind of stuff. It is a world in which we live and carry out our various activities. It is shaped by our culture and particular form of life. Again, this is not empiricism. He's just saying, as a matter of fact, that we perceive things differently than different people in different cultures. And that's true. When we have different experiences, we pull from the experiences from our memory. So if a person has never seen an airplane, and they see an airplane, they perceive, they see an airplane just like you or I do, but they would perceive it differently in the sense of they would interpret that experience differently than we would, because they don't have experience with airplanes. Not that they see it differently, it's not like they see it and go, wow, a bird. But they might perceive it as a bird because they don't have experience with airplanes. The life world is not a distortion of the physical world. Rather, the life world is the most real world, i.e. more real than the world constructed by science. Again, imagine a world made up of atoms. This world right now, the way we see things as it is way more real than the real world as perceived by a scientist saying, oh, everything's made up of trillions of atoms. Which is built upon and logically grounded by a life world. Okay. Reality is real, is what they're saying. Science is how we describe and measure the real world, but this is the same world. We must stick with the world and its objects as they are really given. That's what the phenomenologist wants to do, or the existentialist. But our life world encounters are only informed by science in the most rudimentary way. The full-blown theory itself may be unknown, and in any case remains unnoticed to the ordinary everyday experience. Again, they don't care. Great, the world's made up of atoms. Awesome. That doesn't affect me as a human being. They would say, because this is more of a psychology or a philosophy of mind, they're more concerned about what is going to affect my day-to-day living, or how I live. The fact that things are made up of atoms, millions and billions of people have lived and died without the knowledge of atoms and have lived fine lives. So they don't see that as a need. Not that they don't deny it. They don't deny that. They just don't see it as important in the realm of this philosophy. Again here, human beings live in ways that change over time, and as a result, so does the life world. Phenomenology says history is at its core. Again, they're not saying reality is what we make it, that they consider that to be nonsense. They're not saying that. This would encompass all the standard intentional acts and objects such as perception, memory, awareness of other conscious beings, but now with the attention to the fact that these acts and objects are given to us embedded in history. So all memories which make up reality are found in history. They're saying that history is paramount to understanding how we perceive things. Again, if you've never seen an airplane, you would struggle to understand what you're seeing flying through the air. You might end up reverting back to a demon or a very large bird or a dinosaur or magic or something if you don't have experience with it. But you still don't see it differently than I do, but you perceive its purpose and meaning differently than I do. Philosophy, 511. Philosophy is a historical, backward self-reflection. So they're saying philosophy is a matter of stepping out of yourself and trying to look at how you perceive the world. And the only way you can remember how you see the world, or just step back and think about it, is to think about past experience and past perceptions, because the present is only as now it's past already. So now we're doing Heidegger. Heidegger was Husserl's assistant and pulls from Phenomonolgy, but Heidegger is more of a step towards existentialism, where he's not foregoing epistemology, but he's more looking at ontology or being. As we'll see later, like Albert Camus in his ginormous book, Being and Nothingness, they're focusing on being and ontology and epistemology. Anyway, so it says, like Husserl, Heidegger wanted to account for phenomena as they are given to us. Again, for Heidegger, the starting point was not consciousness but Dasein. Human beings as an entity defined by its practical and existential engagement with the world, doing things rather than just perceiving and arriving at judgments about them. A little lower, it says Heidegger lays out the existential structures of human existence, meaning the universal and necessary structures that underlie all knowing and acting. His Dasein as care. He says, a being that inherits a situation, thrownness, tends to be lost in everydayness, falling, and constantly projects itself into not yet realized possibilities. According to Heidegger, we are essentially historical beings. It's not that we are in history, but that history is in us. So, let me just step back. Thrownness. You are a human being, and you are tossed into the world. Thrownness. Think about it like that. There are some things that you cannot help. Culture, parents, upbringing, stuff like that. That's the thrownness. And then there's the everydayness. This is after you've been thrown, you're falling. There's that falling that you, again, cannot help. It's just you're there, you are in the world as it is, and you're dealing with it. But then there's the project of the not yet realized possibility. He's going to get into that later, and this would be what he calls fate. But don't think fatalism. We'll explain it in a minute. Heidegger rejects the common atomistic understanding of time as a sequence of now points in which the past and future are not real because they are never actual. Dasein's temporality must be understood as a unity of all three temporal aspects. Again, they're looking at the psychology. They're not caring about time as a thing or understanding how to define time even. They're concerned more about how a person perceives the world, and they believe that every person perceives the world with the past, in the present, with a mind towards the future. Has to do with doing and acting. Dasein's existence comes in the form of a life stretched out between birth and death, where one's birth is always still in a sense actual and one's death is always in some manner present. Again, like I just said, you're born. You can't help that. You're thrown in. You're falling through life. You can't help that either. You're just there. But then your decision to acknowledge your death, the fact that you will die, and then the choices that can be made until that point, that's where the phenomenology, that's where existentialism and phenomenology change a little bit, because it's concerned about the psychology. How does a person perceive their life? And the phenomenologist or existentialist wants a person to perceive it in its whole, past, present, and potential future, its potentiality. Historiosity, if you guys are taking notes, concerns the deeper meaning of this process of being stretched out between birth and death. The historiosity is understanding a moment with the beginning and the end all in order, and taking into consideration both. They're concerned more about the experience of time, not time proper. Heidegger says that history and historicity must be received as the very subjectivity of historical subject. Authentic existence, the way we are when we are most true to ourselves, is the goal. So Dasein's way of existing historically is to grasp its unique or own most possibilities resolutely or proactively. It means to take the freedom that you have, the free will you have, and make the conscious decision to acknowledge where you came from, acknowledge where you are, and make decisions based on that of where you want to go. For the existentialists, we must simultaneously embrace the life we have and the reality of death. So Heidegger's account of historicity is based on this concept of thrownness, this unchosen circumstances you find yourself in, and project the future possibilities one envisions out of such circumstances. He calls one's heritage, inherited circumstances or traditions, like this would be your culture. Next he says it comes the formation of a goal that is both shaped by the past and freely chosen. So in reality, you can't freely choose anything. Like let's say you live in a culture where, again, there are no airplanes. So for you growing up, the idea of possibly being a pilot will never enter your mind because you have no concept of flying in the sense of airplanes. So your choices are by necessity limited by your past experience. If you have no experience with airplanes and have never heard of them, you're not ever going to consider the possibility of being a pilot. You may consider the possibility of flying, you may consider the possibility of building an airplane, but of the idea of going to a college and becoming a pilot, it's not going to happen. And the same thing would be for like a person who's never seen a car. You get some aborigine who's maybe never experienced a car or anything like that, they're not ever going to aspire to be a taxi driver because they have no perception of a car, let alone somebody paying you to drive you around in a car. So he's saying that even your future choices are determined by your history and your experience. In a way. Not fully, but in a way. He calls this fate. Don't think fatalism. And he also says destiny. Again, don't think our perception of like Greek faith. Like there's a string and then some unforeseen God or being is determining for you where you will be. That's not what fate means. He's saying you choose your fate, and where you go is your fate. He's not saying that you are fated like a fatalist. Such fate is neither accidental nor predetermined, but self-generated. One is constrained and shaped by the past, but free to appropriate. This is a big word in existentialism. Appropriate it in this way or that. So what happens is you can't help the thrownness, the past, or even maybe your present, because now it's past. But you can appropriate, you can take that experience and change it and use it in any way you want because you have freedom. And form the future on the basis of this appropriation. This whole process is carried out not in isolation from others, but in the context of one's membership in a community. Most specifically, in particular, a generation or a cohort. Again, you are going to be in some ways limited by the experiences you have in history. If you don't have any experience with boats, you're not going to probably aspire to be a sailor. Calls this destiny. This ever-present process of envisaging and bringing about a shared future on the basis of a shared past is at the core of what it is to be Dasein. And it contains the deeper meaning of what it is to be in history, or better, for history to be in us. I wanted to stop for a second and just talk about where this kind of fits into the real world and existentialism, where we have Jean-Paul Sartre, which is going to come up pretty quick. Much of the existentialism and the pull from phenomenology has to do with World War II. After the Nazis had attacked the world and had lost, a lot of them were saying things like, well, it's not my fault, I was doing what I was told. And existentialism kind of bubbled to the top because existentialism teaches that you have complete freedom. And your choice to either murder or be killed, as some of them would say, like if I wouldn't have killed all these people, they would have killed me. The existentialists would say, yeah, you're right, but that was your choice. And you're still responsible. It has to do a lot with responsibility. And then when it comes to fate, this idea of fate, a lot of these guys pull from the Stoic philosophers as when it comes to fate. There's different misconceptions about Stoic philosophy, but I'm not going to get into that. But I'm going to just quote here from Epictetus. And Epictetus says, "For if God had made that part of himself which he took from himself and gave to us, because we're made in the image of God, of such a nature as to be hindered or compelled either by himself or by another, he would not then be God." It says, "If you choose, you are free. If you choose, you will not blame, you will blame no one. You will charge no one." Again, with the Nazis, well, it wasn't my fault, I was doing what I was told. And he's saying, no, if you're really free, this is Epictetus, if you're really free, you can't blame anybody for your decision. You chose. And all will be the same, and all will be at the same time according to your mind, and then by extension, the fact that you're also the mind of God. And he just goes on to just drive home the fact over and over again. He says, "Here, he is free who lives as he wishes to live, who is neither subject to compulsion, nor to hindrance, nor to force, whose movements to action are not impeded, whose desires attain their purpose, and who does not fall into that which he would avoid." So this is what they talk about, and then the Epictetus specifically talks about fate, but he's talking about a fate that can be changed. And this is where Heidegger and the existentialists will use words like fate or faith or these kinds of theological words, but they don't use them in their normal context. So I just wanted to just explain that so there's no confusion, because he's going to use the word fate, destiny, this and that. So to continue, one might say that history is all about past futures, i.e. about the manner in which in the past Dasein has projected itself into response to its past. Much of Heidegger's later work was on the history of being, the history of ways in which being unfolds and reveals itself to Dasein. For modern Dasein, everything appears as raw material. Heidegger sees the history of being as in decline, in distancing Dasein from being and from truth. We're kind of falling further and further away from seeing the world as it really is. It says here that Heidegger influenced the project of deconstruction of metaphysics, whatever. But what his point is, because Heidegger downplayed metaphysics so much, some people misconstrued that, some of his followers misconstrued that as a hate for metaphysics. There's an argument there, but that's a different point. But he argued that maybe he's saying that that has influenced the idea of deconstructionism, and that's up to him to decide if he believes that or not. Later developments in phenomenology. This suggests that these, I got here, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre argues that historical explanation typically involves incommensurable levels of analysis, and suggests that these disparate levels can only be unified by starting not with the facts as such, but with human beings and their self-projections in concrete situations, in order to reconstruct courses of action and arrive at what he calls the event. So again, I think we talked about this yesterday. The idea that you're not constructing truth. You're not constructing past events. You're reconstructing them to try to understand those events. You're reconstructing, meaning you're trying to get the blueprint, the original blueprint, and bring your mind to the place where the actual event was in the past. He says it has to do with Sartre accounts for human existence in terms of tension between facticity, what is given to us, what we get, what we perceive, what we're thrown into, and transcendence, what we are free to do with what has been given. They're, again, transcendental, meaning that we transcend our experience. A person may be, maybe you're racist, and your perception of Mexicans is negative because you've never had nothing but bad experiences with Mexicans or blacks or anything else that's different than yourself, or if you're a black guy with white people. But even though your past experience has been negative, you have the ability to transcend that past experience and choose to take a different path and choose to interpret those events differently. Yes, those events were bad, but you don't need to allow your past experience to taint your future experience. A person can step back and go, you know what, I got robbed by a black guy. But that doesn't mean that all black people are robbers. Or a friend of mine, older gentleman, he's in his 80s, grew up in a black neighborhood, and he's a white guy. He's had a lot of negative experiences growing up as the only white guy in a black school, in a black neighborhood. This is in Detroit. So he has a lot of negative connotations when it comes to black people, because he was feeling the reverse of racism. People were being racist to him because he's the only white guy. So it'd be very easy for him to perceive black people as judgmental and racist. But that would be a decision he'd have to make based on his limited experience, and he could stop and step back and go, you know what, that was how I experienced it, but that may not be how all black people are. Thus, he says, many social and historical categories, such as bourgeoisie, French, women, Jew, American, add any of these categories, are pushed upon us in ways that we can neither prevent nor disavow. So there are some things you just can't help. But how those things that you're thrown into affect how you perceive reality now is a decision that you have to accept or make. Continuing here, we've got Maurice Ponty. He turned to the philosophy of history outside of phenomenological work, Phenomonolgy of Perception, which I have in front of me. He tried to show that human experience at all levels is fundamentally holistic in bodily experience, so that there is no divorcing consciousness from the body as we live in and through it. He insists implicitly against Sartre that freedom is not an all or nothing affair. He maintains that history must be understood not merely from the outside, but from within the experience. So I'm going to just read you just a little part here of Ponty's, of the article he's reading. He's talking about Phenomenology of Perception. He says, time, this is Ponty, time is therefore not a real process, not an actual succession that I am content to record. It arises from my relation to things. Within things themselves, the future and past are in a kind of eternal state of pre-existence and survival. The water which will flow by tomorrow is at this moment at its source. The water which has just passed is now a little further downstream in the valley. What is past or future for me is present in the world. So again, he's looking at it from a sociological or psychological perspective, where there is, for the phenomenologist or existentialist, there is a necessity to understand past and future in reference to my decisions in the present. Alfred Schultz, Phenomenology in the Social World, again with sociology. Schultz explains human actions are a conscious directedness toward determining future goals. Again, for motives, again, focusing on freedom. A person's freedom to transcend their experience and look forward to and determine their motives. Paul Ricker, which is, I would encourage you to read if you guys have ever wanted to understand a little bit of phenomenology. He focuses on hermeneutics and theory of interpretation. So that's where he kind of gets into a little bit more, which is unfortunate they didn't go into detail about Ricker, because that would be a little more about what we'd be probably interested in studying. He says, on his account, narrative is central to both fictional and historical discourse because it's already implicit in the way we grasp our lives. David Carr, on the other hand, again, if you guys ever take time, read David Carr, he's got some good stuff, criticizes Ricker on the grounds that narrative appears merely as a description or ordering of experience rather than as the structure experience itself really is. Carr argues, on phenomenological grounds, that our experience has a fundamentally narrative structure prior to our description of it as such. I would assume that Carr would be saying that to say that narrative is the way we see the reality is probably coming to reality with a preconceived notion or presupposition, and he, as a phenomenologist, would reject that outright because that's a presupposition that you bring to the text. Prospects for phenomenological philosophy of history. I'm on page 515. Phenomenology could offer a philosophy of historicity, neither a philosophical account of history nor of historiography, but of what it means to say that we are historical beings in the first place, or that we experience ourselves, others, and objects around us as having essentially historical dimensions. So again, how we perceive things now, he says, existentialism or phenomenology can help us understand. A little bit further, history is part, and deeply entrenched part, of the mundane, pre-theoretical consciousness and experience. Again, focus on the fact that phenomenology completely embraces past, present, and future as inherent in our current perception of reality. If you don't have history, you don't understand the present. The world is given as predating one's birth. This is something that they assume to be true. So life is experienced by us as having a beginning, middle, and end. We grasp that just as human beings as we grow. Our objects and institutions given to us as having a certain meaning and virtue of their place in history, or is so, and if so, why and how? Is history a point of orientation for ourselves in a way analogous to spatial orientation? Is history always experienced in terms of periods of eras? Or systematic inquiry? Those are things that they would discuss. Go down a little bit more. Will these questions be framed and answered in a universal, trans-cultural, and paradoxically ahistorical fashion, or in terms of the respective historically contingent circumstances of a given history? For example, can one say something phenomenological about the role of tradition, or progress or regress in general? Again, these are all things that would be hard for a phenomenology to explain. But we could transcend them, as the phenomenologist would say. Yet it is not clear whether this is possible, especially with such empirically changing phenomena as tradition and progress. For us, we would say metaphysics is the key. I would think that we'd all agree on that. That part of the way to transcend our tradition and progress would be for us to have a foundation in God's Word, so that we are not, when we're thrown into the world and we're falling or flowing down the river of time, as Ponti would say, it would be our metaphysics or what we bring to the table as Christians that would help us to anchor ourselves in something real. Page 516. So he just continues to talk about how it would be hard for these things to work, but he thinks that phenomenology has some opportunity to help. He says, with something like perception, there is good reason to believe that all human beings, for example, perceive objects as having backsides and other such features, but with historiographic categories, there may be too much variance among different human beings in different historical cultures. He's saying that based on past experience, many different cultures would still perceive many different things differently. So he doesn't know how much a person could really expect to understand about the past based on, as a universal rule. You know, he doesn't really hold out a lot of hope for universal historical laws. What this means is that phenomenology may intersect with historiography in important ways, but in ways that are that implicate a rather impure sense of phenomenology. Phenomenology may have to accept that when it comes to history, it must be culture-based. As a non-believing phenomenologist, that would be true. Just as an example here, I have Albert Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. And one of the things, talking about thrownness, falling, and then expectations for the future, Albert Camus says, famously, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. The reason why Albert Camus says this is that as an atheist, you have to admit the fact that you're going to die and your life is going to amount to nothing. And during the time of this writing, there were people who were killing themselves after accepting this reality, as he explains it. The metaphysics that he was building upon for his life were atheistic metaphysics, meaning nothingness, materialism. So he equates human life with as a myth of Sisyphus. We're basically thrown into the world, and we find ourselves pushing a rock up a hill. Pushing it up a hill for no real reason, beyond the fact that we just have to because we're thrown into it. And then, as far as the future is concerned, we have to accept the fact that it has no meaning or purpose. It's nothingness. So he would say that we have to, and I wish I could find the quote, but it's something along the lines of, as absurd as it sounds, we have to imagine Sisyphus is happy in the project of pushing the rock. So, all said and done, he argues that a person needs to make the choice, the free will decision, to give yourself something larger than yourself to base your life on. Otherwise, you will inevitably end up killing yourself, because that's really the only real choice a person could make. Because you're thrown into the world, you can't choose when you die, you can't choose where you're at, and life is pointless. So the only real decision a person could make is kill yourself. And he's saying, no, you can make lots of different decisions. And one of those decisions that you could make is you could choose to be happy and give your life meaning, even though it's absurd to think that, because in reality life is meaningless. So for a good Christian perspective on existentialism or phenomenology, Kierkegaard would be a good example. I'm not going to get into it, but Kierkegaard is an existentialist and a Christian, and he would completely disagree with Albert Camus' take on metaphysics and on Albert Camus' take on the meaning of life. So anyway, so to sum up David Weberman's article, he believes that phenomenology absolutely has a lot to offer every human being, an understanding of the place that history, or the role that history plays in our lives. But he doesn't really believe that this, that phenomenology, basically as a philosophy of mind or psychology, really has much to offer as to historiography and method. Thanks.